going to start off by giving a tiny introduction to our two speaker guests. So first of all, we have Julie Andersen. Julie Andersen is the CEO of Plastic Oceans International and a lifelong public health advocate focused on the communication of science and disruption of societal barriers to protect human health and the environment from the negative effects of industrial development. So it is very nice to see Julie here with us. And as well, we have Charles Rolsky. Dr. Charlie Rolsky is the Director of Science for Plastic Oceans International. He's also the host of Breaking It Down. And with Charlie Rolsky, a YouTube series from Plastic Oceans that simplifies the science while having a bit of fun. He is the Senior Research Scientist at the Shaw Institute in Marine, where he works on linking environmental health to human health through scientific research and outreach. So I am delighted to give this introduction, and I think we are ready to start off. So I'm going to mute myself and let the Charlie and Julie take on from here. Thank you everyone for joining.
Great, thank you, Sue. Really appreciate the introduction. I'm excited to be here with Charlie, Dr. Rolsky. Today we're going to talk about our relationship with plastic, and I'm going to introduce why it is complicated. We'll start on the next slide. First, I want to talk about plastics. There's a lot of assumptions before we tackle this bigger picture of the complicated system of plastic. The assumption is we all are in agreement that we have a serious problem with plastic pollution, that it's found everywhere, and that it has lots of negative, it's having a lot of negative consequences. And that's why we are really focused on trying to solve this problem of reducing and ending plastic pollution. However, our relationship with plastics, and some of the things I wanted to highlight here, the positive qualities of plastics, or at least the positive qualities from a human perspective, a social perspective, a beneficial perspective, the positive qualities of plastic are what really contribute to the negative impacts of plastic. Plastic is very lightweight and versatile material. It's this great innovation that humans have created that make it very easy to produce and transport around. Plastic is cheap as a result. And because it's cheap, it provides easy access for people to consume all goods at a vast rate. But it does democratize the society as a result because it's so cheap. But what does this cause? This causes plastic literally to be everywhere. And with plastic being everywhere, plastic pollution is everywhere and is causing irreversibly harming our environment, our health, and animal life. And so I highlight that it's plastic and plastic pollution that are really increasing faster than we can manage both. And I highlight both here, plastic and plastic pollution, because it's the way that we struggle with really implementing solutions around plastic and plastic pollution because of how we think about plastic and plastic pollution. And how we think about it is here in the next slide is a linear thinking of plastic pollution. So if you highlight here, if you look at the dark blue arrows here, it's a linear model. We think of it as we finance oil, we use oil, gas to produce plastic, we then use plastic, consume it, we throw it away, we have waste management of it. Currently, we have poor plastic waste management. We have leakage into our environment, leakage, illegal and unintentional leakage into our environment, which then contributes to plastic waste in the ocean. What this linear thinking is, we think of this as linear, as if there is an equal effect all the way through, as if we increase the waste if we were to decrease waste management or decrease poor waste management, that would equally decrease consumption or decrease production. We see it as very equal all the way through. therefore, we tend to focus on plastic pollution at the very end here, where we focus on the illegal import, export of the waste, or we focus on poor waste management, thinking that if we focus heavily on that, that'll automatically fix the production, that'll lower the production side. However, in reality, plastic pollution is if you go to the next slide, plastic pollution is part of a system, sorry, one before. The current systems way of thinking of it is they're not equally related. Plastic pollution is part of a plastic system where the parts have multiple relationships. So the relationship between proper plastic waste management and plastic production has a different relationship than plastic use or consumption and plastic recovery. And those interactions all impact the overall system. Now, what does this mean? And this means that they have different relationships, and you can see how I have plus signs and minus signs in there. And this means that they're not these interactions are not quantifiably equal. So if we were to decrease consumption or decrease plastic use by 10%, that does not mean that we decrease plastic production by 10%. If we were to increase plastic recovery or recycling by 5%, you see the negative sign that goes to illegal plastic waste. That does not mean that decreases plastic pollution by 5%. So there are special relationships that work throughout here that are not equal. And it's understanding this whole system that is critical to understand. Currently, we do not have it quantified. We cannot say that, oh, if we increase recycling by 100%, we would decrease plastic production by 8% or 9%. We do not know these numbers. However, this is where education and science is so critical to the system. So if you go into the next slide. The reason that I first wanted to emphasize why we really need to move away from our linear thinking where everything is equal and where we focus only on one part of the whole system and start to think of this whole system as a whole is because for plastic and plastic pollution are interrelated, but not equally, and thinking in systems will uncover the hidden causes and effects of plastic pollution. And systemic analysis, seeing the whole system, starts to consider the multidimensional perspectives and relationships that we have with plastic. And that is cultural, scientific, social, political, industrial, and economic throughout the entire life of plastic, from it being extracted from the earth as oil, made into plastic, used, disposed, and its mismanagement or proper management. It is an entire system that is contributing to plastic pollution. And finally, really transferring and transitioning from this linear thinking, a very simple cause and effect of plastic pollution, all equally made down from production, use, and end of use. That system thinking allows for the coordination of different solutions and initiatives to be integrated simultaneously within a collaborative closed loop system. And if we go to the next slide, I'll talk about that closed loop system in a second. And what we will focus on today really is the systemic approach to addressing plastic pollution really comes from educating on the different relationships and the different parts of the system. And as we learn more about the different parts of the system and how they work together, it is then where we can advocate for laws to support those systems that work and also change our behaviors, our consumer behaviors, our consumption habits to to really foster a closed loop system. So if we go to the next slide. I think today we are talking about like really building, understanding the different aspects of some of the science aspects that are critical to painting this picture. And science is critical to really analyzing and quantifying the different relationships within the whole system. However, and I think it's important to understand that before Charlie talks about these important, the different science components that contribute to the system, it's important to understand that science, the job of science is to understand the parts of the system. And I use this example. If you see elephant, this analogy as a systems approach, if you have an elephant, and the elephant right now in the room of the world is plastic pollution, but we're trying to figure out, well, where is it coming from? Science is analyzing the different parts of the system. That is the job of science, to really understand and quantify, so we can understand, well, if we improve waste, if we decrease consumption, how does that affect waste management? How does that affect production? If we increase use a different type of material, how does that impact waste management in real numbers? So when we see, what I want you to start to see, and like when you listen to Charlie's scientific information here and learn more information about it, is really understanding that these are still parts of the system. So the next slide. Those parts, so as we learn about and increase the education and awareness, we start to make better personal habits and personal choices that affects our consumption, changes our consumption models, which starts to close the loop. So if you look at the dark circles, you start to see that we're reducing plastic pollution, and we are starting to keep a lot of the plastic inside a system that we can control. And that education, that awareness starts to build reinforcing loops, which means supportive legislation that helps keep that plastic in the system that we can control. And it also helps to change our global practices as consumers, and how we contribute to use and waste management practices. And balancing and controlling these. This is a lot. However, I'm going to revisit this after Charlie gives his talk and really start to apply and talk about how his information can apply to this. So we'll revisit all of these slides again after his talk. So I think as we go forward, it is now, as we build on our plastic awareness, it's what do we know through science, and how, after we learn about what Charlie talks about, how this is going to support a closed loop system of thinking. So that I will pass it to you, Charlie.
All right, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us. It's exciting for us to be here and chat about this. It's very relevant in so many of our lives. So it's great to kind of go over what we know and what we've learned, and exciting new pathways of research and exploration. So thank you all for being here. Please go to the next slide. So we know and understand that plastic is a threat, and we can kind of zoom out and establish why, right? So macroplastics are anything typically larger than 5 millimeters. Those threats are generally pretty well understood. If you think about the iconic video of the sea turtle having the straw removed from its nose, it presents a choking hazard. It presents an opportunity for an animal to feel full. It won't eat anymore after that. A lot of times they could die from malnutrition. That bottom image underneath the sea turtle, I think those are bags that were pulled out of a whale's stomach that had passed away. So there's a lot of really obvious threats when it comes to macroplastics or larger plastic items. Microplastics are definitely less understood. They're smaller, which generally means the risk can go up. Scientists began sort of exploring whether or not these were taken into the ecosystem. So in that first image, those were plastics that were dyed on purpose to see if they would be taken in or consumed by a lower level organism, such as that shrimp. And you can see it definitely concentrates inside the stomach. at a pretty high concentration relative to what's seen in the water around it. So even though these are somewhat understood in terms of their threats because they're so small, sometimes they could just be inert. Sometimes they could be eaten by an organism and pass through without causing any harm. So really, this is an area we're trying to understand more of, just so we can get a sense for what those threats actually might be and what those impacts are for animals and for ecosystems and for us as humans. Next slide. So how do they get so small? How do they end up this way? Next slide. So typically, if you think about a beach environment, we've all been there many times, you see a lot of items like this that are pretty prevalent. You know, it's a definite sign of our impact and our presence somewhere is what we leave behind. And generally what happens to these items is what happens to us if we're kind of unprotected on the sand there. Next slide, please. It's exposed to the elements, right? So if it's outside for too long in the sun, you'll get sunburned, and the same thing happens with these polymers. They can become more brittle. They can fracture. You know, it takes a pretty long time, but this is kind of the process that it takes. You also have the physicality of the ocean itself, right? So repeatedly the waves can crash and hit. There's a lot of rocks. Those two can kind of work in tandem to weaken it. And then, you know, what happens if you open your eyes in the ocean? It's obviously uncomfortable. You've got quite a bit of salt in there. And those three factors over time can take those larger items and break them and fracture them into smaller plastics that, you know, are typical for what we find on a beach today. Next slide, please. Now we see a lot of these headlines, right? And it's almost overwhelming to see we're finding plastic pretty much everywhere. It's on the top of our highest mountains. It's at the bottoms, the depths of the oceans and trenches. We're finding it in our food. We're finding it in the air. It is very overwhelming. And, you know, sometimes the headlines don't match the research. Sometimes we can tend to go down a path where we get kind of overly scared about something before we understand its impact. So if you've ever gotten to the point where you're overwhelmed by all of the news and media, we are right there with you. It happens to all of us. And again, it kind of just takes us back to understanding what this impact actually is. And so for me, I go back to the science and start understanding what the research has demonstrated. Next slide, please. So you have relatively a high amount of inputs of plastic waste into the environment. You have that same process that we talked about before, where larger things are fragmented over time, whether it's UV sunlight, whether it's, you know, physical degradation or chemical degradation. You also have a pretty big pathway with our clothing. A lot of our clothing is synthetic, and there's quite a bit of fibers that are shed, whether it's in the wash, whether it's in the air. You also have what we call primary microplastics, or microplastics that were created to be small. And those can include nurdles. Nurdles are those pre-production plastics that are generally melted into a mold, and then that mold is what we use for something later on. And a lot of times those can just be spilled, or they can be transported, or there could be some sort of cargo ship that breaks, and those end up in the ocean. Those are pretty much a microplastic from the get-go. And then you have items like microbeads, which were used in a lot of exfoliants and cosmetics. And President Obama did ban those at one point, but they're still all over the place. You can still purchase items on Amazon or something that have microbeads that are plastic in them. So you have a lot of inputs that end up taking plastic waste from landfills, from, you know, our waste infrastructure, from the environment, from our cars, from our tire. I mean, a lot of different inputs exist that would start a microplastic in, you know, its journey as a pollutant. There are a lot of inputs. Next slide, please. So as I said, we have primary microplastics and secondary microplastics. The primary microplastics are created small from the beginning and pretty much are microplastic from the get-go. And it starts that process of it entering the food chain relatively quickly. You then have the secondary microplastics that fragment over time, that go through weathering and end up entering the environment that way. Generally, it takes longer for that process to happen just because it has to fragment. Not all animals have a mouth big enough to eat something like a utensil, but primary microplastics can enter through so many different ways. And basically, it starts at the lower end of the food chain and or at the bottom of the food chain, whether it's on land or in the ocean. It's consumed by either, you know, plants. It can be taken up by their roots. It's taken up by you know, simple organisms in the ocean, and then it not only moves up the food chain, but it will concentrate up the food chain, as you saw with that shrimp. You know, there were individual particles all around it, but in the shrimp, it had a concentrated amount. And the more shrimp that are eaten by the next step in the food chain, the more that it concentrates and goes higher and higher, much as we've seen with things like DDT and other harsh chemicals. Next slide, please. What this amounts to is a distribution of plastics all over the world and all different substrates. These were samples that we collected from many different countries, from people that would just send them to us from their local beaches. And it kind of gave us an idea, not only as to the distribution of the plastics themselves or the movement of the plastics, but what type are we finding, to be most common in the environment. And this has a lot of implications. Sometimes it's not good enough to just say we found a plastic because they behave differently. Polypropylene might have a different chemical structure than polyvinyl chloride. We know vinyl chloride, for example, is a carcinogen. So it's important to know what the plastic is instead of just reporting it, especially in this day and age of these newer materials, these newer bioplastics. It's really important to understand the polymer itself so that we can better understand its relationship to the environment. Next slide, please. And this is where our research comes in. We want to understand this entire pathway. This is what polyethylene looks like when you purchase it from a lab or a lab distribution company. It's those nurdles, those pellets right there that you see that are melted to form the conventional PET bottles. And then when those bottles, again, encounter quite a bit of weathering, they end up as particles that we can extract from the environment in that third little filter that you see there. This entire pathway is important for us to understand and document. And that's what we've really strived to. Next slide, please. One of the biggest concerns with these particles is their ability to biomagnify, again, as we said. Now, you've got kind of three threats when it comes to them. You've got the actual physical threat itself, right? You've got something synthetic that's now being consumed or taken in gills or eaten by us. You have the ability for the internal chemistry to be brought out. As we said, polyvinyl chloride. Vinyl chloride is a carcinogen and is definitely harmful. And then you have the ability for plastics to interact with chemicals. Plastics are either conventionally hydrophilic or hydrophobic. They either like water or they don't like water. What that means is they have the ability to attract other hydrophilic or hydrophobic things, whether they're bacteria, phytoplankton, other chemicals. Research has actually shown them to be able to concentrate chemicals up to 1 million times stronger than what's found in the surrounding environment. So you've got kind of a myriad of threats now that they're bringing with them. You have to not only understand what the particle is, but is it concentrating something on the surface and delivering it into the food chain? You have other exposure factors, which we now are understanding more, especially if you get into the nano world. We know that they can pass through the blood-brain barrier. They can be sequestered in our filtration organs. They can be found in our skin. This is the research that I'll talk about a little bit later that we're really trying to better understand, because this is where you actually have a direct health link between these particles and something within an organism, something within us. Next slide, please. And the EPA is pretty much on top of this in terms of identifying what should be considered a threat and how we should go about labeling something a public health concern. One of the things that kind of took me when I first started researching this is we would look at something like plastic. We would look at bivalves or things like oysters that are meant for human consumption. They had plastics in their stomach. Same with mussels, same with the water that we're swimming in. And then we would take it a step further and start looking at things like seabirds. Okay, we're finding heavy amounts of plastic there. Marine mammals, finding plastics there. And then people, we didn't know. But if we're following the same system, if we're swimming in the same ocean, if we're eating the same seafood, there's probably a high likelihood that we're having the same negative effects as these animals. And oftentimes we kind of look at humans as being exterior of kind of the ecosystem and all of these animals when we're as much of a part of it, if not more, as they are. So it's really something that we wanted to start looking at and understanding more, especially as it applied to humans. Next slide, please. As it stands in our house, there are many opportunities for us to be exposed to plastics. We're finding it, there's studies finding it in tap water. There's always ambient fibers. If you're wearing heavy amounts of synthetic clothing, a lot of fiber is shed in the air with things like honey, beer, bottled water. There's heavy amounts of plastic in a lot of these production lines. And because these production lines have quite a bit of physicality, it's easy for these materials to be shed and then pass on to us. This is just a few of them. If I were to try to outline all of them, this slide would be very populated. It would be overwhelming. So again, it's that kind of linear process. It's knowing that we're finding it, knowing that it causes these negative effects, knowing that there's exposure pathways. This is where we try to find the happy medium between, saying like we have cause for concern and that we're lacking research to maybe demonstrate it fully, and then running around with our head cut off and screaming and yelling and crying. It's really hard to find that middle ground, but that's what we're really trying to focus on moving forward. Next slide, please. With Plastic Oceans, we actually conducted a study to try to create a method to extract plastics from human tissue. It hasn't really been done yet up to that point. It's very difficult to do for many different scientific reasons. If you think about all those different exposure pathways, if you think about a conventional lab has quite a bit of plastic in it. It's kind of like a hospital, right? There's certain things that interact with things that are biohazardous that you just want to get rid of. So it's really difficult to create a method to be able to do this. And it's something that we worked on quite a bit. And we looked at, again, those filtration organs like the kidney and the liver. We also thought about lungs as being a pretty high source, especially this day and age. We're wearing PPE. A lot of masks are made out of plastic. So it was a really important step for us to take that I'm glad to say now we're actually able to continue. As you can imagine, it's not easy to get samples of human tissue. And when we first started this process, it was kind of us exploring it and seeing if people were interested. Now, because there's so much concern, we're having doctors contact us left and right, asking us to go through some tissue samples. So it's been a really interesting process, and we're gonna continue talking about it shortly. Next slide, please. Another area that's really interesting for us to talk about are bioplastics. So a lot of times what we're really good at is being really bad. And what we do is we create something we don't really fully understand its impact maybe post-use. We're also good at finally understanding something's impact and understanding that it's also not great, and then replacing it with something that's so similar it often replicates it. So we're seeing these bioplastics. We're seeing the word biodegradable thrown around quite a bit. It's a really tough word to use because it doesn't really have a standard definition. Technically, anything could be biodegradable over millennia. So where do you draw the line? And there's a rotating definition that kind of floats around in terms of it degrading under certain circumstances within a certain amount of time, having the right infrastructure. So we're creating things like polylactic acid, which is corn-based, and polyvinyl alcohol, which is oil-based, and we're calling them biodegradable. We're calling them plant-friendly and eco-friendly and all this. So it's a little bit of a slippery slope. It's one of those things where you find the middle ground between saying, well, it's not actually correct in its labeling of something by definition, but also saying maybe this is a step in the right direction. And that's really kind of what we want to be able to find, which is why I myself have gotten in the habit of being more open-minded to listening to hearing this and not just shaming it, but okay, if it's a step in the right direction, let's support it. Or if it's not right and it's, the label is actually incorrect, then we can call it what it is. But it's definitely an interesting time to be in this space, to say the least. Next slide, please. One of the polymers I just mentioned was polyvinyl alcohol. You might not have heard that yet, but everyone is familiar with those dish and laundry detergent pods, right? Initially, people were trying to eat them. That was fun for natural selection. And now we sort of see that people are transitioning away from that, but saying, well, we're avoiding this big plastic bottle and it dissolves in the water, everything's fine. The problem is that it is a water-soluble polymer. So when I say water-soluble, think about table salt. Put salt in a glass or sugar in a glass, it dissolves. You don't see it anymore, but if you drink it, you taste it. So the constituents are still in there. It just becomes more like a solution. So we actually ended up doing a study to try to understand how many of these pods are used and how much of it breaks down. Our lab at the time had a very extensive history of wastewater treatment plants, which is the next step after you flush and it leaves your house. The wastewater treatment plant is designed to break things down and create a really rich fertilizer. And that was sort of the next step for us to look at this in more detail. Now, we were just doing this as an exploratory thing. It's a model. It's not perfect. You have a set of assumptions. You look at a conventional wastewater treatment plant. But the best thing about it is you can base it on 55 other studies that have looked at PVA degradation in wastewater treatment plants. That's where this kind of was birthed from. So we combined known data about how many of these pods are used with the amount of biodegradation that occurs in a wastewater treatment plant, and then the amount that's left over. And that gives us a pretty good extrapolation in terms of how much goes undegraded through wastewater treatment plants and into ecosystems beyond. It's called a mass balance. It's something that we do quite a bit. Now, this paper that we published had to go through peer review. That's 3 independent experts going through the entire process. And all 3 have to agree that it's publishable, and it goes through rounds of reviews. You have to make corrections. If just one of the 3 experts that reads the paper says it should be rejected for various reasons, it gets rejected. So publishing is very difficult, and that's it for good reason. Our information is vetted. They check pretty much every part of the paper. It's a really good system. It's a very difficult system, but a very good system. Next slide, please. What ended up happening is we got kind of cornered by a group called the American Cleaning Institute, which kind of oversees the really big brands that you kind of think about, Tide and all those other groups. We ended up getting some nice coverage in the Washington Post, and that's only because they really came after us and submitted official comments saying that our paper was flawed, the data was wrong, to the actual journal where we published it. And you know, in my space in academia, criticism is vital. It happens during my PhD, criticized when we, you know, put the paper together, criticize. That's how the things improve. It's a good thing. Constructive criticism is very healthy. It got to the point where there had to be an independent expert brought in to go through our entire paper, to listen to the claims from this other organization and determine whether or not our paper was still valid. And it was, in short, everything in our paper was valid. And I won't get into the details, but they retracted their comments, and you know, we tried to move forward. Next slide, please. They have ended up coming out with these blog posts that they claim to have all of these decades of evidence, and we just kind of sat there and said, we'd love to see this. Like, we've gone through and found every paper. If you have a new one, show it. You know, let's see it. And this is the route that they've kind of been going, because the other route got them a little bit in trouble with plagiarism and copyright issues. So they continue to promote this message. But for us, this is a really important thing, because if you zoom out, it demonstrates kind of an interaction between industry and science and advocacy. And what are the standards? What are these terms? What does biodegradable mean? And maybe that's why this continues to happen. But that was one of the things that I kept scratching my head about. Why is this even allowable? Why are we learning these things later on? Why aren't these tested? So I had a lot of questions, and not trying to be facetious, I generally had those questions. And so we started to kind of look into it more. Next slide, please. Ultimately, our paper showed that if we start with quite a bit of PVA in these pods, only about 25% breaks down in conventional wastewater treatment plants, 75% passes through. This was a pretty high number for us. It was pretty alarming. And again, this is based on 55 plus other peer-reviewed papers that had studied the relationship between PVA and biodegradation. So it was really telling for us to learn these things. And it again brought that question: why does this keep happening, and how is this allowed? It's happening right now. You can go to the store and buy these, and then it's plastic that goes into the environment. Next slide, please. The EPA has something called the Safer Choices list. If you go on the Safer Choice list and you type in polyvinyl alcohol, they assign it a green circle. The green circle means it's been verified to be of low concern based on experimental and modeled data. Now, this is such a big deal that if you look at that 7th generation package on the left, it actually says on the top, EPA Safer Choice certified. So it's like this cycle where they'll say it's safe and then they'll promote it as being safe. That's really vicious and a bit wrong, to say the least. And if you look at these labels, let's just say you didn't know what they were. You've got plants, you've got eco-friendly. That one on the right legit says plastic free. I mean, it's like it's shocking that they're able to put this, but why? Because of that green circle. So we actually had an audience with the EPA, and we went through all of this stuff. And I said to them, okay, your definition says low concern based on experimental and model data. Could I please have that? I'd love to read it. And they said it's protected. No. Which if I were to say that, it probably wouldn't fly. Oh, I found the scientific claim. Okay, Charlie, let me have it. No, it's protected. Okay. That was strange. So then I said, well, are you aware that because of your designation, people can put that it's free and clear and plastic free and biodegradable? We have no control over that. Okay, sure. what you start to learn is if you go on these websites and it's not just the pods, it's the sheets too, as you can see on the right there. If you go in the fine print, I mean fine print, sometimes it's a challenge. If you ever want to have some fun, good luck finding like the FAQs and finding the ingredient list. But it's hard to see because it's so small. Those blue circles on the bottom, that's all showing polyvinyl alcohol. That's the cover in all of these pods and sheets. It's used a lot. It's very frustrating as a scientist, again, for them to say this is biodegradable, that it's plastic free, when it's made without any bad stuff, as they say. It's really difficult to be in this space at the moment, and it really ultimately boils down to it being claimed to be biodegradable. Again, based on these studies, which I can't find because I don't know, whatever. Anyways, go to the next slide, please. It does bring up a really important point, and it's distinguishing between biodegradable and degradable. So what we did is we looked at like a real world scenario, right? It's a great case study. The water leaves your house after you do a wash. It's got the pods material in it, and it's now exposed to a wastewater treatment plant. Now, a wastewater treatment plant is going to have fluctuating temperatures. That picture there, a lot of the processing of a wastewater treatment plant is outdoors. We know the outdoors is going to have a fluctuating temperature just based on the time of day. There's a pretty big fluctuation in temperatures, especially based on where you live. You also have to have these microorganism species, quantity, food, all of that has to be controlled and stable for them to break down a lot of this matter and then have it be used as fertilizer later on. It's a continuous flow where it's always got water coming in, and it's always got solids and liquids leaving, because there's quite a bit to treat. If you think about big cities, they have a lot of wastewater treatment plants, they have a lot of water to process, so it's this continuous flow or else it would get backed up. And ultimately, you're left with maybe 18 hours to 15 days of total treatment. Now, 18 hours is relatively short. That's based on one situation. 15 days might be if the wastewater treatment plant incubates the material for a while, giving the microorganisms a chance to kind of break it down. But at most, it's there for 15 days. Now, in this degradable scenario, what a lot of these companies will do is they'll promote this kind of fixed temperature environment where they test everything. When they have to pass these testing procedures, they end up doing it in a lab. Now, a lab is going to have very fixed temperatures because it's indoors. It's not exposed to the elements. It also ignores these degradation indicators and these degradation factors when it comes to microorganisms. It creates the most perfect environment for the microorganisms that, again, does not exist in the real world. It also uses this, what we call a fixed batch reactor, meaning it's this wastewater treatment plant environment is enclosed. They control everything. It's not exposed to the elements. It's all contained within this system, which is unrealistic, again, when you talk about real world scenarios. One of the studies that they improperly cite says that it breaks down this much and it's biodegradable. The problem is, in that scenario, it was in this perfect environment for 28 days, which is longer than the 15 days. So again, unrealistic. So technically, the material in this situation is degradable. If you look at the real world scenario, it's not. And that explains why 100% of it doesn't break down. But the problem is, because of this degradable situation showing that these results were achieved after 28 days, they can then use that to go to these groups and say, look, it's biodegradable. Start using it, let it dump into the environment. And yet there's not a single study really that exists showing that it behaves well as a pollutant in the environment, that it just biodegrades. So it's a really important case study. It's really important to understanding what sustainability is, what bioplastics are, what biodegradation is. And it's frustrating, but it kind of gives us a starting place. In my mind, what should happen is these companies that use the material should pay for studies to be done to show that it's benign in the environment. And if that were to be the case, then we could say, with certainty, as a pollutant, this will be fine, it'll biodegrade. Until that happens, we're just making these materials that end up in the environment really quickly, and we don't know the impact that it's having. For me, not knowing something freaks me out. So it's kind of a difficult situation to be in for that reason. And a lot of times people are saying, well, Charlie, I'm not using a jug, so we're good. Let's talk about that. What happens to a jug? Well, the jug you put in the recycling bin, There's maybe a 10 or 12% chance it gets recycled. Otherwise, it'll probably go to a landfill. Now, we know as plastic gets smaller, you start to increase the threat or its prevalence or its ability to get in the environment. It's going to take a while for that jug to turn into microplastics. This becomes a solution immediately. As soon as it encounters the water, it's now a solution with very, very small particles that have high surface areas that are in the environment. That's what freaks me about this. And so it's just a really interesting situation that we're in at the moment. Next slide, please. Everyone always asks me this. It's a place of comfort. If I just tell you, remove X, use less of X in your life, this will all get better. It's very comforting. I wish I had that answer. I do have the answer on the next slide. It's very complicated, just like what Julie was talking about. The diagram that she was showing is reflective of the situation that we're in. Think of it to the food chain, right? The food webs. We've all seen them, right? Grasshopper gets eaten by the bird, which gets eaten by the bigger bird, whatever. Remove one of it and it has a lot of different effects, but they all are equally important in that situation. They all have different impacts. So if you look at an airplane, what percent of an airplane inside is made out of plastic? Quite a bit of it. Of qualities that are really beneficial. I think I might lose my headphones in a second. Let me just prep. Same thing with electronics, right? Electronics, when you have them, generate heat. And when it generates heat, you need to have a material that's not going to warp or melt. So it's used there. If you go to a hospital, like I recently had an MRI, that whole enclosure was made out of plastic. Again, it serves its purpose well in that situation. And in that situation, it's likely to stay there. If you look at grocery shopping, right? Reducing food waste is so critically important for things like climate change. And being able to use the packaging creates less waste. If you look at that cotton bag there, I think a cotton bag has to be used 7,000 times to offset its carbon footprint. It's complicated, and that's okay. I think it's okay for us to understand that it's a very intricate system. To a certain extent, we need plastic, but we don't need waste. We need innovation. We need replacement, but it's okay to say in certain capacities it's useful, in others it's awful as a pollutant. And that it's complicated. Totally okay. For me, it's like the environment. If I go out in the environment right now and there's an invasive species out there that we want to get rid of, okay, we can get rid of it, but maybe it's doing something useful. So we have to consider that. This dynamic approach is very normal, and it's just okay that it's complicated. I just like to tell people it's okay. Go to the next slide, please. It becomes important to distinguish between what we might need and what we might not need, right? So we also did a study on contact lenses, and we found that I think it was around 25% of people were flushing their contact lenses down the sink or the toilet. Now, that doesn't mean we should make biodegradable contact lenses. It doesn't mean we should make them out of something else. They serve a purpose. They allow your eye to breathe. You're reducing bacteria exposure. That is a plastic that we need that's essential for a lot of people. Just throw it away the right way or recycle it efficiently. Bottles, cutlery, I mean, there's other types that we might not need as much. And so we can kind of rank them, right? And there's, when you say, okay, let's go with this other option, there's going to be effects there too. If I were to look at this plastic bottle and say, okay, let's transition to paper. The carbon footprint of paper is very tough. Paper requires a lot of water. It's going to be a little bit of a different impact. That's what I try to kind of explain to people. It sounds bad, but it's kind of like saying, do you want me to punch you or kick you? It's like, well, they're both going to hurt. I'd rather have this one or that one. But there are, middle grounds that we can find. And that's just important for us to consider moving forward. Next slide, please. What I'm really excited about is material science. So I worked in a lab, did a postdoc in a lab that kind of created this term of above ground mining. It's saying, like, we already have this material. This material is meant to last a long time. Let's use it a long time. Let's stop going to the earth to pull out, oil. Let's utilize what we've already created. And so we took some really novel approaches there by taking plastic, grinding it up, turning it into filament, and then using that to 3D print new items. Very, very, interesting and innovative. And there's a lot of things being done in the space now where you can look at the chemistry of plastic and what about it makes it bad. And then you can replace it with green chemistry. You can look at something that's found in the environment, similar bond structures, insert that in, and then you've got this new material. Now, again, the middle ground is making sure you don't create something that's just the same thing as regular plastic, that's oil-based plastic. But that's the kind of energy that I was around for a while. I'm not sure if we can play that video of on the image on the right. It's not a big deal. But in the hopper, you can see those small plastic particles. That was actually from a hospital. So I took some medical waste and grinded it up and then extruded it into filament. And then I started 3D printing things for the hospital. So instead of them buying new things, I could 3D print something from their own trash, which was really exciting for us because hospital waste is pretty ridiculous. I think if healthcare was a country, it would be the 6th largest emitter of greenhouse gases on the planet. It's a lot of plastic waste. So it's an area that we definitely want to get into to try to help. Next slide, please.
I think now, Julie, this is your.
All right, there we go. Excellent. Thank you so much, Shirley. That was a lot of information. I almost feel like we should do a Q&A just right now for all that, if there were any questions on a lot of science right there. So there were some great questions in the chat that I'm hoping to address as I go back to where I introduce like how we approach and start thinking about this, to really wrap our heads around how we apply what we know about plastic in terms of plastic as a material, plastic as it degrades, its properties that degrades and enters into the environmental system and then impacts our health, and how we take that information and start to really see how it fits into a larger system. If you go to the next slide. So I just want to revisit this slide again, where this is our current system model of plastic pollution, and why it's so important that we start moving away from this linear thinking of where everything is connected, and that we take science and we think, oh gosh, if science breaks down and it goes into the environment, we should ban all of these type of materials outright, and that'll solve the production problem. That linear thinking of thinking that everything is equally related, to where if you stop the last domino, or you stop one domino, everything else fixes itself. That's not how the system works. And by starting to change that and starting to see that, even when if you go to the next slide, sorry. So as we transition to how plastic really interacts within the system, how we are starting to close that system. And by closing that system, that means not having unregulated, illegal, unintentional leakage of plastic and its known and unknown properties that affect the environmental system. The idea of this system, and to start thinking of it as a whole, is to recognize that the global problem of plastic pollution is not just one system. We have systems within our countries, within our states, within our communities, and it is aligning all of that. And as much as I would love to say, that the UN would ban single-use plastics tomorrow, to get countries that depend on single-use plastics for survival, for their water, for their basic health needs and food sources, to eliminate that becomes a huge social and economic part of this economic part of the system. And that's why there is no banning outright from a global level. That is part of the deep discussions that are currently going on and being negotiated at the international level as they develop a global treaty that puts in best practices. And just like the Paris Agreement around climate change and carbon, as much as there is a treaty in place implementing laws at a country or a local level to support those, to adhere to those global goals is challenging, to say the least. And so it is important to remember it's never as like easy to like focus only on the end stage where it's the consumer. We don't want to just say, oh, it's all the consumer and the consumer habits and one system. If everybody were to stop using plastic, we'd solve the whole problem. I wish that was that easy. It's also important that we recognize where science supports legislation, where we need to have science to adopt the best practices. As Charlie mentioned with PVA and the PVA detergent pods, there is controversy among scientists even of what to accept and what those best practices are. And as they report to those legislators have to decide which one are they going to, what side they're going to believe. So there are those complications, and that's why it does become it becomes critical for us, for people to understand, legislators to understand, policymakers within our communities, with at state levels, to understand and adhere to start to think of to adopt a systems thinking and apply the scientific knowledge that is coming out every day and implement those practices, best practices. So if we look at this slide, again, we're starting to transition to a closed loop system in some ways. The dominant dark circle, the dark blue arrows are the dominant system. It still is pretty linear. When you'll see as it goes from oil to production to use, and it says proper plastic waste management. That is up for debate. Proper plastic waste management varies from town to town. Here in the United States, it's definitely, even within, I live in Los Angeles, even within Los Angeles, within communities and neighborhoods of Los Angeles, waste management practices differ. Not to mention California versus Texas, California versus India, California versus Mexico. These proper waste management practices are controversial and still need to be implemented and equalized, and those relationships are dependent on budget, cost and infrastructure budgets. But you can see that with the increase of proper waste management, this would probably decrease plastic production. With an increase of plastic recovery and better plastic recovery would increase proper plastic waste management. But in order to increase that thickness of the line of even proper plastic recovery, or increase that relationship with proper waste management, that comes with science knowledge. And what Charlie touched on is, well, what do we know about materials? If we use plastic, if we know that plastic breaks down and enters our waste management system, and now it's not treated in our wastewater treatment plant, how does this affect our proper plastic waste management systems? So it's starting to take this knowledge and research that's coming from waste plastic materials and starting to see how it interacts and relates to waste management, how it relates to plastic production, and how do we increase it? And that also is coming down to a local level. And this is why I think as we take in this knowledge, it's seeing our consumer habits and how we affect our local community and spreading that systems knowledge. And it's important that we start adopting this systems knowledge. Can you go to the next slide? Sorry. In order to close this loop, because it does start to build this awareness. And by continuously starting to see this knowledge being applied and developing, this is an ideal, this is what we want to adopt, this closed loop system model. By starting to see this as a system rather than linear, we start decreasing the vulnerability of greenwashing, because if we think in linear, we will always start thinking, well, I hear this material's better. Why don't we ban all of these plastics? Why don't we ban all of the gas and oil? We start pointing blame, and we start thinking that there's an end all one solution fix to this, when it is much more complicated. By thinking of it as a system, we also we do start to work together and collaborate on how we can implement multiple solutions simultaneously within the system. So we can work on waste management practices, consumer behavior practices to change consumption models, supportive science to support science that supports legislation that reinforce those type of practices. We start to see ways to close this loop. If you go to the next slide, please. Sorry, next slide. So as we go into taking that system thinking that we want to do, and we apply some of the knowledge, that awareness that we just learned from Charlie, that scientific knowledge of knowing material, the type of materials that work within our waste management systems, those that don't. PVAs seem like a great way to reduce large bulky plastic, but if they get into microplastics and they don't filter in our wastewater treatment plants, is that the best material? Probably not. So we probably could use that information and go into and advocate for laws that put limitations or support or have better research before we start developing new materials that we think are going to solve the problem, when they only will add to the problem. So part of that legislation plays a huge role, but the knowledge that we have and the knowledge that we support that comes out of science supports the legislation. Legislation and policymakers make their policy choices and decisions based on our, when I say our collective power as citizens, our collective power as activists to educate legislators, our way of how we consume that puts pressure on producers and manufacturers. These all play roles. And as we continue to educate ourselves and change our own practices, we can't go out and change 8 billion people tomorrow, but we can change our own habits. We can continuously push out the way that we think, and what I always refer to as a mindset, a systems mindset that we are applying and getting people to get on board. Because by polarizing and blaming one part of the system, only polarizes and keeps us in the problem. The second systemic approach is that I'm talking about here is that globally, there's still a weak link between the problem of plastic waste and consumption. And when I say weak link, it's not understanding the quantifiable impact. Again, if we were to eliminate all single-use plastics tomorrow, if we just had a blanket single-use plastics ban tomorrow, what does that mean? Does that mean that all of our medical equipment goes away? The products that we use for science that are disposable, does that go away? How do we replace those products? If we can't provide clean water to certain sources, to much of the global south, how do we provide, how do we recover that? How do we take into consideration the social impacts that are there? There's also this education of how it then, you take in this information about how it affects our health, and it's getting into our water systems. Well, if we have microplastics getting into our water systems and we don't have clean water, where do we get that? And how do we filter it? What is our middle ground in terms of getting water sources in different vessels than water bottles, plastic water bottles? And a lot of those things, it's not just a global north where we have the access to alternatives, but there is the global south that may not have access to alternatives. And the the financial budgets for infrastructure to have access to those different alternative materials that are there. And one thing I wish I is to remember, global north, where we do have access, we do have more influential power in legislation. It is with this knowledge that we can put pressure on that global power, that global pressure. And it's important to remember that the global south, that makes up 85% of the global population, also manages most of our global waste. And they do not have the infrastructure to manage that global waste. So much of our global waste that is improperly managed is sent to the global south by the global north that consumes. So there is that within that is a major system flaw of how we illegally or unregulated, or there's no accountability of how much we send to areas that cannot have proper waste management, needs to be accounted for. And that will come with, that is also a big discussion with the Global Plastics Treaty that is in negotiations right now. If you go to the next slide. Well, I guess I'm already there. I mean, that's it. Thought there was another one there. So one of the ways that I thought, if we go through, it's either a Q&A that we can go through, but I also, if there's not lots of questions, I haven't been able to look at the chat. But if we can have a discussion, we can open that up to an open discussion rather than just chat, or we can use really the detergent pods as a key example of how it addresses, science addresses a new material that seems disposable on first hand. When it first came out, everybody says it's great if there's some science that supports it, but then there's clearly science that shows that it does not, it adds to the problem. The previous science of PVAs doesn't take into account a lot of information. So the use of this product, I think, is a fun exercise if we work around that, but otherwise we can maybe open it up to discussion if anybody wanted to jump in. Otherwise, I can go over some of these questions if I can read them, or if Sue, if you happen to read any of them. Let me go back up here.
Yes, absolutely. Some of them have already been answered.
Yeah.
And so I'm gonna jump to those that it hasn't. I think we have one here from Katie Fournier. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name, but it says, do you have any opinions / perspective on plastic credits to incentivize businesses to reduce plastic use?
I did answer that one, and Charlie, you're welcome to disagree, but my view on plastic credits are similar to carbon credits, where it's just another greenwashing tool for what really wealthier companies to buy out those credits from others that aren't contributing to the problem of plastic. The actual tool itself doesn't change the bad habits that we have, or the bad production habits, or incentivize better practices or better production of plastic. It just allows a producer or a company to continue with some of their bad habits, is what I think. And it doesn't take into consideration the systemic model that we have. It's just a band-aid solution, and it's not even a solution. It's a greenwashing tool, in my opinion.
If Charlie doesn't want to join in, perfect. I'm gonna go to the next question. She's from Victor Rujano in Venezuela. And he says, what would be the best way to communicate the gravity of the situation of plastics? People's everyday lives are intertwined so much with plastics, and not many countries/cities offer alternatives to move away from plastics, and especially single-use plastics. Indeed, it's a very complicated situation, especially in countries from the global south. I agree with you.
Absolutely. Personally, the reason I am so passionate about transitioning and starting to really think of this as a system is to take away the polarization. As much as I I know that I would like to say, oh, all plastic producers, they can do better. They're not incentivized to do better. They don't have to. So constantly pointing blame is not helping the system. Counting on only looking at the end, the downstream solutions on recycling and waste management practices, only focusing on that alone is not going to solve the problem. So really, it is seeing the whole system and recognizing we have to improve recycling methods, as well as support legislation that incentivizes better practices, that we support better inclusion of scientific knowledge about different materials. We include different economic structures and payment models to support infrastructures, for waste management infrastructures. So really, to talk about the complexity starts at it starts within your community or state, city, country. It starts on a smaller level, in that it is at that local level in which you can operate. If you don't have access to drinkable water out of your tap, I can't tell you don't drink bottled water. But can you do recyclable bottles? Can you have jugs of bottles? It is those small solutions that do start to that truly make a difference, but it works within the system of where you're located. But to always recognize that we are still all players within a whole.
Yeah, and I agree. I think from my perspective, it's kind of what we said before. It's okay for it to be complicated, and I try to explain both sides, because I think if people understand why it's used, then they'll start to understand why it's so difficult to replace. It's a complex system for that reason. You know, I brought up food packaging, right? Well, it reduces food waste. Okay, well, plastic is bad, get rid of it. Okay, well, then all the food's going to, go bad unless we have an alternative. And will the alternative be as cheap? And if it's not, are we okay with the prices of everything going up? There's always going to be an effect. And it's about understanding that. And then maybe that allows us to better understand the transition to something else. But far too often, I've heard of people just saying, ban it, get rid of it, when we don't live in that world. Like at this point, we're too far past that. We need to understand what we're utilizing it for, and then we need to get more creative with how we can replace it, how we can make it better. And that's, I think, the wave of the future is truly being able to replace it without noticing a difference. Other than that, it's making things around us more sustainable, and it's improving things. But it's tough to teach. And I think, again, it just kind of comes down to what's the good and what's the bad. And that's the world we live in. It benefits us and it harms the planet. And I think understanding that fully is what's going to make us a little bit more, I don't know. It's just, that's the path, in my opinion, moving forward. But to each their own, and we all have to find a way to communicate that effectively. It's not easy, and I applaud anyone that works on that.
And just to, I'm reading both Katrine Perchat, and Barb's comments and questions, is that where both are sort of addressing that we have to start somewhere. And if you think in a linear system, it's easier to digest and start to target along that linear system. And if you think that linear it is, then putting pressure on the production. If we were to reduce the production of plastic, we would definitely reduce the potential increase of plastic pollution and how it's managed right now. This goes back to one of the benefits of really starting to push a systems thinking approach to this and not thinking linearly is that it does polarize things. And just in that linear model, if we think of it linearly, the plastic producers also say, well, then it's not our fault. It is the plastic pollution side. It is a waste management side. So they use the same argument that you're using. That is, oh, well, if we are thinking linearly, and it's not, if we're just doing, it's not plastics, not the problem, it's the pollution's the problem. And the pollution is a waste management side. And if we think linearly, yes, that's true. Let's just keep focusing on the waste management. But in a system, it is plastic and plastic pollution that simultaneously need to be addressed. And by thinking in a system, we don't enable them to use that same argument and continuously redirect all of our energy to be focused downstream on this linear thinking method. That makes sense.
Thank you. Yeah, and actually, Katrine Purchett is one of our Blue Communities members from the Seychelles. So nice to see you here, Katrine. I can see there's like a full-on conversation going on here. And I think most of it has been answered. So I love that. There is one last question from Liv, who's actually part of our Plastic Oceans team. It says, what are your thoughts on EPR, so extended producer responsibility, a policy approach in which producers are given financial and or physical responsibility for the treatment of disposal of post-consumer products? That is actually a good one.
I'll pipe in here with my opinion, but you can start, Charlie, if you like.
No, I think it's a very good question, and it's an innovative strategy, which I think is what we need. We need innovation in whatever we're doing. What we're doing is not really working. There's some things that are effective, some things that aren't. My reverse question would be, what are the implications and what is the impact? And if it means, you know, negative consequences for the business, I would want to understand that. Obviously, we can think about what the benefits of that would be, and on the surface, it sounds like a really good idea, which I really like. But I would want to put myself in the shoes of the business owner and say, okay, how does this affect us, and what is the degree of our responsibility? Is it a system that's so difficult to abide by that will cost them money, resources, time? Is it too extreme? Sometimes these thoughts can be that very demanding. But it's a really interesting idea that I would love to understand the complexity of, and that's the kind of collective table that we need to sit at, is understanding how it would benefit the environment and our communities, and understand how it would impact the business. And that's what I really want to, before I speak to things, I'd like to, that's what I try to better understand. But Julie, I'm definitely interested to see what you think.
I think in theory, extended producer responsibility sounds amazing. If you made every producer fully responsible for their plastic product, that would be great. Where it starts to become complicated is when the producer is Unilever or Procter & Gamble, that it works. But when you are a small business now in a small community that is buying a little bit from them, and they are considered a producer for their community, it's no longer equal playing ground in it again. And so the strict rules that would apply to a Procter & Gamble or an Exxon or for producing, then does that apply to the small business owner, the small business that barely produces anything, and they are taxed at a high level? That's when it starts again to really impact heavily the global south or even smaller communities. And that's the discrepancy of applying, or that's the challenge of applying a heavy-handed law that seems like it would fix everything, but then 85% of the world's population really is the one suffering, where the 15% of the population that can afford it doesn't affect them, and they continue to use and consume at a high level anyhow. And then to me, it is just, if it's not clearly stipulated, the law, then it turns into another form of plastic credits. Currently, there are two states in the US, Washington and Maine, Oregon and Maine, and that implement the EPR laws. But the laws, the stipulations, it's basically, they're just paying for waste management. Oh yes, here we use this, we'll pay for some of the recycling. Now, do we fully understand all the costs around the recycling of that plastic? Are we banning it? No. Is it really incentivizing them to eradicate it? Not so much yet. So there's a lot of information that still is unknown to really put in clear stipulations to make that a blanket law.
And Julie, living in Maine currently, I can tell you that while there is a bag ban, I've never seen more reusable bags in my life. So I think a lot of times these companies see a plastic bag ban and they just say, okay, I'll just convert that waste into a bag, a reusable one, which then can shed fibers. I mean, the carbon footprint of these reusable bags is tough. So it's always going to be that kind of complex system. There's always going to be cause and effects. And so yeah, but I agree. It's interesting for me to now be in the state where I see these things implemented, and it's a what do they call that, bottle bill state. So we have that system here as well, but it's an interesting perspective for sure.
And Bertossi, I think that I put it in. Let me find where they put and they address, like, this is again where the system thinking, I know probably most of you already thinking of system thinking, but why it's so important to spread this to others is, yes, it is critical for producers and to be responsible for completing the circle of the system. But even with like the current EPR laws in the US, it is the producers are driving the downstream solutions. They're paying, yeah, sure, we'll pay for the recycling, we'll pay for waste management. That still continues to be arguments that they push, that is implementing a linear way of thinking. And I even think nonprofits like ourselves, we fall into the trap of, oh, well, we'll fix this, we'll do the cleanups, we'll do recycling, and we need better materials. It still doesn't take into consideration how we can collectively work together and move it not just out of recycling, but we really simultaneously push the science and the collaborations that are needed to support legislation that is effective for all. And so that's why it really does, it is critical that we start really thinking about simultaneous approaches and initiatives throughout the system. There isn't going to be one, but there's going to be multiple consumer habits and others. And if we go to the next slide, I think maybe this might be slightly out of order now. Talking about collaborations is then, it is why we work with, where Charlie works is at the Shaw Institute, different research institutes that continuously is providing more scientific data that supports different changes that will support these legislations. The more we have, more knowledge and more scientific data that we have that supports like the impact of bad recycling practices on health, the more nonprofits like Plastic Oceans can go and educate legislators and say, this is why we cannot have this bill without this stipulation, because it impacts human health. We cannot have this type of material because it is not recyclable and it will get into the water system, impact the environment and human health. This is the advocacy and activism that we need to continuously increase social awareness, increase education to change consumer habits and consumption models, as well as support legislation that can be directed on the producers, rather than just constantly, let's keep, like, if we buy glass over plastic, that's going to change the system. That's not going to implement a policy. It might change some of the businesses, but that's not going to change a policy. So it simultaneously, there is the advocacy side, and then there is the awareness building side that are working throughout the system.
And I wanted to actually quickly address one of the comments I saw. The contact lens research we did the work, we published a paper, we presented it at a conference, and because of education and advocacy and working with groups like Plastic Ocean to put the information out, it created enough buzz for the entire industry to shift. The entire contact lens industry shifted, and that became relative to the area. England, for example, put forward an entire recycling program for contact lenses in the blister pack they came in based on that study, which then worked with Plastic Oceans, which, I mean, the movement can create change. And it not only creates behavioral change, I can't tell you how many people told me afterwards, I used to flush my lenses, I had no idea. So it can create change on a personal level, on a business level, and on the level of an entire country. So we've seen it, and it's a powerful force. It really has been so fruitful for us. because I can only do so much, right? You see all the stuff we work on. We work with marine mammals. We do monitoring of the coasts. We work with lobstermen. We have, a lot of outreach programs that we do. But if I don't work with another organization, that just stays here. But if I can partner with Plastic Oceans, if we can work on a film together, they have capabilities that we wouldn't dream of having. We're a scientific research institute. So if you can create that way to take the science and convert it into something visual, you're just expanding the audience and the impact. And it's really been so fruitful for me to see as a scientist, because otherwise, again, the information would just stay here, which is great. But if it needs to spread, if it needs to create meaningful change, it needs to go beyond our border. But yeah, we've been doing the work for quite a long time. It was founded by Dr. Susan Shaw, and we really enjoy the work here. And broadly speaking, we do focus on connecting environmental health to human health through research, through education, through outreach, and it's been a lot of fun being out here. I think there's one more slide.
Excellent.
Or a couple more
Thank you.
slides.
One more slide. Well, and this is what this is what Plastic Oceans is constantly trying to and really embed the systems mindset into how we approach our initiatives and ending plastic pollution, an approach to end plastic pollution. There is no quick fix. It is not an easy task, but it is through activism, education, advocacy, and science that we are working simultaneously to really build awareness around the systems of plastic, working with through our Blue Communities initiatives is really recognizing how critical it is to work with different organizations at a local level, because they understand the system in which they operate, the knowledge gaps and the barriers that they face, and really represent collectively how all of these local communities, Blue communities, really come together collectively to represent a system. And one of the ways that we really push education, go to the next slide, push education is through films. And the reason we are a unique organization that uses films, and we try to embed the systems mindset of sustainability, is really seeing that there are constantly different parts that need to be educated. And it's always reinforcing multiple education sources and consistent messaging throughout our communities, throughout the legislation, using the same messaging we're giving our communities to legislation, and really aligning it to our collective global goal, which is to end plastic pollution. But it's that constant reiteration, constant consistent messaging that we need to do to build that systems mindset. It is not oh, I heard it, the problem must be fixed, and letting it just hear it and think somebody's fixing it and it's done. It is a constant iteration, and it is a challenging process. I mean, our Blue communities work exhaustive. It's an exhausting task for them to work within their their populations and the barriers, and how there is a discrepancy between their communities and even within their states' communities or countries' communities. So it is a constant task, but it is very much possible. I'm going to end on that note, that it is very fixable. We all work within our systems. As Charlie mentioned before, our entire planet operates within a system that works. And as soon as we can sort of accept that we are part of a system, and our actions in this plastic pollution system is very much part of the whole, and vice versa. So I think that on that note, for those that want to learn more, you can always go and check out our films. I think somebody put it on there. We will also have this presentation available to rewatch. And I just want to, end. I think the last one is probably a thank you. I want to thank everyone for participating, and I thank you so much for all of your questions. Charlie, Dr. Rolsky, I really can never thank you enough for all of your research and knowledge sharing and being part of this process. And I think that I want everyone to know that we're all part of this process, all part of the system, to really aim for ending plastic pollution for a better planet.
Well, thank you. It's an honor for me to be able to talk about it. And it's always great to have these conversations. There's so much to be learned, and hopefully we'll have more soon.
Excellent. Now, we will definitely have more soon. There, as you can see, it's complicated. And so I hope to see all of you in the coming months for our next class.
Thank you
everyone.
everyone so much. I'm gonna stop sharing our beautiful presentation. So we can come back here. So everyone, thank you so much for joining in. As we mentioned in the chat, and as Julie just said, we will share the presentation with you guys via email. You can also access it through our YouTube channel. I think they also added like our link to, plasticoceans.org. So you can also access it through there. And you guys, if you have any questions, anything, we're always happy to help you out. And thank you everyone so much for your time and for wanting to keep up this fight with us. So thank you.
Great. Thank you.